Great. Well, it is once again my pleasure to introduce our colleague, Professor Caryn Aviv. She is the Posen Lecturer in Secular Jewish Culture at the Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Dr. Aviv's areas of interest include gender and sexuality, Zionism, LGBT studies, Israel and Palestine, and contemporary Jewish cultures. Professor Aviv is co-author with David Schneer of Queer Jews and also of New Jews, The End of the Jewish Diaspora, published in 2005. Dr. Aviv's current project is titled Unappointed Ambassadors, American Jews and Israeli-Palestinian Reconciliation. And one of the things that is not noted here in her bio is that Caryn is currently the co-chair of the Women's Caucus of the Association for Jewish Studies.
A huge job.
A huge job.
Thank you, Andrea. So good afternoon. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me okay? It doesn't sound like it's on. Test, 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 test. That's better. Ooh, a little feedback. So good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I want to thank all of the people of the Posen Foundation for organizing a really intellectually stimulating program. I kind of feel like my head is going to explode, but in a good way, so thank you. It's also particularly meaningful for me to give this talk here at the New School because it's my own alma mater that I attended and graduated exactly 20 years ago today, for this year. So I'm dating myself as either a youngster or just middle-aged. So, when I graduated in 1991, I received a copy of Theodore Geisel's Oh, the Places You'll Go. It's a whimsical children's book whose narrator encourages the reader to seek out new adventures. And along the way, that adventurer encounters unexpected difficulties, challenges, constraints, strange alien creatures, and the inevitable pain and disappointment that life brings. So I had not thought about this book in years until my daughter picked it out as her night-night ritual, and she's 5. And as I was reading it to her, I realized this is for my talk. I realized that the narrative arc of this book is actually the metaphor for the course that I currently teach at the University of Colorado at Boulder, which is entitled, sometimes it's called Global Jewish Secular Society, sometimes it's Global Secular Jewish Societies. It's all great. So like the young and enthusiastic hero of Oh, the Places You'll Go, my undergraduate students are asking developmental and existential questions about self and identity, such as, who am I? What do I want to do with my life? Who do I want to be in the world? And where in the world do I want to go? And I'm curious, how many of you have read that book before? A few. OK, so you know what I'm talking about. Great. So I realized that if you look at the trajectory of Jewish histories and contemporary communities over the past 150 years, it's not a stretch to say that many Jews, both as individuals and in collective groups, in different places and under different political circumstances, have also asked the same questions of themselves. So I see this course and also this talk as sort of a whirlwind tour of Oh, the Places Jews Will Go. And what I'd like to do is briefly describe how I use history and sociology and cultural anthropology to infuse each word of the title of this course, not only to give them a thorough dose of secular Jewish studies, but also to try and speak to my students' developmental and existential concerns. So are you ready? You want to fasten your seatbelts, turn off your cell phones, stand clear of the closing doors. We're going to begin with the word global. So what that means, I don't know. But my course uses a comparative lens to engage debates and concepts regarding Jewish people, places, and notions of belonging and difference on a global scale. Is this, I hear a little like feedback. Is there something going on with it? Not to be a diva or difficult or anything. But do you hear it?
There's a little beep. I heard a ring.
Yeah, I hear a beep.
This one actually sounds better because it's not on right now.
Okay. Can you hear me now? I feel like Oprah. Okay.
Right now.
Okay.
It's, which one do you want?
I think I prefer this as long as it doesn't beep.
It's better with a lavalier, actually.
Okay, that's totally fine.
Yeah. Maybe we can angle it a little.
Sure.
But I don't hear the feedback.
Okay, great. That's better. Oh, that's better. Great. Okay, so what we do is we explore communities that might be considered the usual suspects, like, let's see, who do we have? Whoa, I'm just using Keynote for the first time, by the way. So we explore New York, and on the left is the New York Jewish Film Festival. I love that image. It's like my grandmother. We also go to LA, which is the image on the right. And then below, we go to Moscow, and that is a picture of the GUM, which is on the Red Square next to the Kremlin. It's the huge Soviet-style department stores where the shelves are empty and sad, unfortunately. We also go to places that are not the usual suspects in my class, such as Havana, which is, that's a very famous synagogue in Havana, and also Tehran, which is up on the right. Oh, that's much better. Thank you so much. So what my students do is they examine how historical time and spatial location and relationships to political regimes influence the construction of Jewish identities in lots of different places around the world. And this necessarily involves an interrogation of concepts such as Jewish encounters with state power, or factors that prompt migration, exile, and diaspora. Also the rise of nationalism and nation states, and notions of political citizenship, of tourism, and of travel, which are two of my particular obsessions. So how we approach these issues is to engage in a comparative analysis of Jewish communities and Jewish institutions and organizations, and also individuals across very different places and spaces. So in other words, to translate, how have Jews, primarily in the last 2 centuries and today, understood who they are, partially because of where they are, and in relationship to and in interaction with various other groups and ideas around them? How do Jews influence others in the places that they live, and what do they leave behind if and when they move on, which is frequently? So as a case study of contemporary globalization, we look at Russian Jewish communities and identities around the world since the demise of the former Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And you might or might not know, but in the past 20 years, the sociological subfield of Russian Jewish diasporic identity and culture has emerged and really come of age. And in fact, the most recent issue of Israel Studies is entirely devoted to papers in this area, which is fascinating. So after a historical analysis of life, Jewish life during the Soviet Union, what we do is we explore relationships between Russian Jews who have decided to stay in Moscow. Let's see if this works. And then we also look at Russian Jews who have decided to move to Israel. And so this is actually Mikros, which is a Russian-Israeli theater company in Tel Aviv. We also go to Berlin, and that is a Jewish-Russian school of people sitting around studying, learning German and Hebrew. And we also go to think about the Jewish community, the Russian Jewish community here in New York. And that's just a picture of Regina Spektor, who's one of my favorite singer-songwriters. And also we visit the Russian Jewish expat community in Berlin, which is one of the largest, actually. And that is a picture of the relatively recently constructed Daniel Libeskind Jewish Museum. So what we learn is that how post-Soviet Jews have and have not acculturated to, sometimes by choice, the different cities around the world that they live in, and also how they maintain very cosmopolitan ties and relationships to the various and far-flung networks of families and friends who live elsewhere. Okay, so now we're going to get to the contested words secular and Jewish. When I use this word, secular, what I mean is both an approach to studying Jews and also some dominant expressions anthropologically and sociologically of what does Jewish identity look like in the modern era. And when I ask students to define the word secular, they usually have some, I don't know, vague notion that it means not very religious. So I try to disabuse them. Oh, sorry. They think that it's not very Jewish. Not Jewish. Like secular means not Jewish. And I try to disabuse them of that notion. And what I think they mean is not very religious. Okay, fine. I can live with that. So on the very first day of class, to open up the discussion of what does secular mean, we watched The Tribe. which I'm sure many of you have seen. And in fact, you wrote a curriculum about it, didn't you? So it's Tiffany Schlein's, sponsored by the Posen Foundation. I actually used material from that. So this is a very popular, well-known documentary by Tiffany Schlein that came out in 2005. So after screening that documentary, we try to unpack what the documentary says about contemporary and contested Jewish manifestations of the word secular. And believe me, that's a lot to take on the first day of class. That's fine. So my approach to studying the secular and Jewish experiences of secularism in particular, I don't assume that there's some intrinsic or essential or hierarchical understanding of Judaism as a route to understanding Jewish identity or history or culture. Rather, I draw on some concepts from the sociology of religion, like pilgrimage and conversion and defection, and also the notion of religious enclaves. But what I argue is that studying Jews from the perspective of Judaism, and particularly the notion of belief or ritual practice as some precondition for belonging, that is not what this course is about. So many of my students, interestingly, whether Jewish or not, and whether explicitly or not, they assume that authentic Jewish expression looks like this. So this is Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was the charismatic, as far as I know, the last charismatic leader of the Habad Lubavitch movement, who died actually in 1994. But his presence is still very pervasive amongst Chabad missionaries. So I find the fact that my students associate this manifestation of Jewishness as the most authentic Jewish expression, it's troubling to me, but it's not surprising. And it's not surprising for really two reasons. First, my students come from a range of backgrounds. Many of them are not Jewish. I teach in Boulder. And they tend to equate religiosity and religious observance as somehow authentically Jewish, in part because Chabad rabbis and Chabad outreach workers are so easily identifiable as like the biggest Jews on campus, and particularly in Boulder. And secondly, the aggressive Chabad folks, they often deliberately represent themselves as the true arbiters of Judaism and as the paragons of authentic Jewish expression. They're charismatic, they actively seek out Jewish students, and their mission, they've got real clarity of mission. They want to introduce Jews to their version of what they brand as authentic Judaism. So that raises an interesting conundrum for me in a class on secular Jewish culture, because it's almost impossible to talk about contemporary Jewish life without encountering and analyzing Chabad. You just can't do it. And in fact, I think to not do it is intellectually dishonest. And we can argue about that. Indeed, several of the course texts that I select engage with this question of Chabad. And I ask my students, why is it that Chabad Lubavitch is often the first one into an emerging Jewish community to conduct outreach or evangelism, depending on what language you want to use, and bring secular Jews closer to ultra-Orthodoxy? I'll give you one example. I have my students read a sort of memoir travelogue called Far From Zion that was published a couple of years ago by Charles London, who's a Jewish journalist who had to figure out what does it mean for him to be Jewish, and he went all around the world. And interestingly, every single chapter references Chabad in some way. And so, for example, my students learn about the very odd and very ambivalent relationship between the local Chabad rabbi and the largely secular Jewish community in Bentonville, Arkansas, of all places. Why there is a rabbi, a Chabad rabbi in Bentonville? Any takers on that one? Walmart. Thank you very much. That's why all the Jews are there. And that's why the Chabad rabbi is there. So similarly, we also try to figure out why was Chabad one of the first global Jewish organizations to establish a presence in the former Soviet Union in lots of cities. Any answers? With the demise of the Soviet Union, there was no organized Jewish life. And so it was a complete organizational vacuum, which means a great political opportunity. And so in that regard, Habad is very opportunistic. They're very savvy and strategic. So I'm not sure what to do about this dilemma. And I would love some feedback because it's interesting. I don't want to obsess about Chabad in my classes, but you can't help it if you're doing a sociology course on global Jewish culture. And I think that defining the secular in this course necessarily entails an intellectual engagement with the range of contemporary expressions of Judaism as religion for some people, but by and large, not for everyone. So that question requires that students engage with the phenomenon of Jewishness as defined by some, like Chabad, as religiosity, and by others as a resolute rejection of any religiosity, any theology whatsoever. So when we talk about how and where and why religiosity and Jewish difference has been reified, both by non-Jews, sometimes with devastating consequences, but also by Jews themselves, it's discussed heatedly and repeatedly and without any resolution. And I take this as an opportunity to ask students to define and discuss and debate the meanings of religiosity and secularism more generally, and invite them to look at how Jews identify as Jews across a spectrum of difference from one another, and also in conversation with non-Jews. So by asking students, what does it mean to be Jewish, and who gets to define that, rather than what is Judaism, the course asks students to confront the expression of difference within Judaism, among Jews themselves, and across contemporary global Jewish communities. That's the secular, and that's the Jewish. How am I doing on time? Okay, I'm doing fine.
You're doing good.
Great. So now I want to turn to the last word in the class, which is societies. And then rather than organize my course by a particular intellectual topic like secularization or modernization, I actually begin with place and with location and a particular point in time, usually in the past 150 years, one that is usually significant politically or economically or socially to the Jews of that place. And then what we do is we explore the broad contours of historical events and processes that Jews have experienced in that location, leading up to an analysis of who are the people, who are the organizations, what are the issues that are going on in that particular community. And we also ask, is this community thriving? Is it declining? Is it sort of stagnant? And they get to analyze that and assess it for themselves. So because this is mostly a sociology course, it's not necessarily linear. And we repeatedly return to a few persistent themes. So when we focus on, for example, New York and Buenos Aires, and I'm going to give you some pictures. So that's Ellis Island, late 19th century in New York. And there is Boulevard Callao in Buenos Aires. We discuss how the migration of Jews from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries really transformed those cities from within, albeit in really very different ways. And we examine how Jews have subsequently negotiated processes of integration, acculturation, how have they participated in political, social, and cultural changes of those places. And let me give you a case study example that's kind of off the beaten track. Has anybody ever been to Iran? You have. You are a lucky man. That's awesome. So I'm not surprised. I ask the same question of my students. Usually nobody raises their hand. But the Persian Jewish community of Iran is actually one of the oldest extant, continuously existing Jewish communities in Jewish history. And so it's a fascinating case study to think about the issues that my course raises. So what do? We study the Persian Jewish communities not just in Tehran, but also in LA. And we compare them to one another. And interestingly enough, after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, over 100,000 Persian Jews made their way to Israel. So think of it as a triangle. So Tehran, Tehrangeles, and Tel Aviv, or Holon, if you want. So we look at what happened in the late 1970s when the Shah's regime fell and many thousands of Persian Jews made their way to Westwood. in LA, which is where my parents live. And by the way, I just have to tell you anecdotally that 20 years ago when my parents moved to LA, in Westwood, the entire building, if you look at their condo roster, it was all Schwartz, Rothbaum, Goldberg, et cetera. Now it's Shiraz, Faruz, like they're the only Ashkenazim left. And it really reflects the massive demographic shift of Jews in the same neighborhood over one generation. It's fascinating. So now let's fast forward to 2011. Currently, that small Jewish community continues to live in Tehran, but also in Shiraz and Esfahan, and they receive special political status and certain constitutional protections despite living under an Islamic regime with a head of state who is not such a friend of the Jews, frankly, in his anti-Israel rhetoric. So how are these communities similar? How are they different? Have the Persian Jews of Israel and LA integrated and assimilated into these new settings? Or have they chosen the route of ethnic insularity? And what's the reception of the other Jews around them when they have arrived? What difference does it make in a migration and settlement process when one community lives in a Jewish nation state, while the other lives in a pluralistic, multicultural democracy with a separation of mosque, synagogue, church, and state? And have Persian Jews' engagement with Judaism and Jewish practice changed over time in these places? In fact, the Persian Jewish community, both in Tehran and in Tehrangelis, are extremely conservative religiously and extremely conservative on gender egalitarian issues. But in other ways, their minhag, their customs, have become much more flexible and open to different kinds of changes. So let me change tack for a second. Another question that winds its way through my class is this. How and why are so many current and formerly Jewish places haunted by traumatic memory and the ghosts of the Jews who no longer live there? That's definitely the case in Tehran. It's the case in Berlin. It's the case in Moscow to a certain degree. Lots of Jewish places are haunted by ghosts. Still another theme that emerges is how do Jews selectively remember and document and memorialize the past in order to make sense of the Jewish present, and also how do they project their fantasies or desires or fears about the Jewish future? And in answering these questions, we often look at Jewish museums in very large cities, such as New York, as institutional and cultural expressions of how Jews see themselves and how they seek to represent themselves and the Jewish experience to the wider world. So the last thing that we do in this class is we explore contemporary manifestations of Jewish travel and tourism in multiple directions. And I have to admit that this is my favorite part of the class. Not surprisingly, in a course that analyzes and deconstructs the Jewish notions of homeland and diaspora, we travel to and we travel from Israel. So first what we do is we read sociologist Shaul Kellner's recently award-winning book, Tours That Bind, Diaspora, Pilgrimage, and Israeli Birthright Tourism. And we think about how Birthright Israel has changed the landscape and changed the conversation about American Jewish travel to Israel, and particularly young American Jewish identity formation. So in this unit, we ask about what are some differences between pilgrimage journeys, which are often associated with religiosity and a desire to commune with some sacred place. And then how does that differ from more secular forms of travel, like Birthright to a certain degree, that is aimed at Jewish political mobilization and postmodern identity construction? And then we look at the notion of pilgrimage and identity travel in opposite directions. So in other words, we look at the sociological phenomenon of tiyul. Does anybody know what tiyul means? Tiyul means a trip. But in Israeli sort of youth culture lexicon, it means a rite of passage that is taken by young, mostly secular, post-army Israelis who are like 21, 22. They get out of the army and they save up all their money, they pack a duffel, and they're out of there. And they go all over the world to India, China, Thailand, South America, among other places. And so what we do, I love that slide, it's so great. What we do is we ask some questions from the emerging ethnographic and sociological literature on this phenomenon. And I ask, why is it that Israelis, of all people, create such tight boundaries of the enclave, to borrow from ethnographer Jackie Feldman? Why do Israelis, who are largely secular and often don't identify as Jewish religiously, why do they travel only with other Israelis in communal large groups? It's like kibbutz on the road, and they're well-trodden circuits. So in fact, this upper left-hand corner, it's a video it's a documentary that just came out. It's called Hummus Curry. And it actually profiles one town in northern India that has been completely transformed by Israeli tourism. And thousands and thousands and thousands of Israeli young people make their way to this particular village, which, P.S., is in the middle of nowhere, because it's on the circuit. And so it begs the question, how does Israeli secular Jewish tourism influence local tourist economies? That's exactly what this documentary explores. How does this kind of travel influence or change their notions of self and identity and Jewishness? India is where Jewish secular Israelis discover yoga and marijuana. And it has profound implications for what they do when they get back home and they integrate yoga and marijuana into their secular, or sometimes, becoming religious Jewish practices and communities. So we compare American Jewish travel to Israeli travel because the motivations and the sort of parameters and the characteristics of these two examples are so profoundly different. So if, as Shaul Kellner argues, birthright trips are how young American Jews construct meaning through the consumption of place, and where, I'm quoting him, where modern nationalism and postmodern transnationalism meet, unquote, then how do their secular Israeli peers differ in their own pilgrimages? What is the underlying purpose of their attempts to get as far away from the Jewish homeland as they possibly can? And how do the participants in both these cases engage in deep quests for self-understanding and meaning as contemporary Jews? So finally, I ask students to put their conceptual knowledge into practice by creating an empirical case study of their own in the local Colorado Jewish community. And this is the last part of my course that I'll describe. My students spend the last 6 weeks of the class, there's some pictures, I'll explain what they are, analyzing the online Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Archives, which are actually at the University of Denver. They read about the history and development of Jewish life in the West. They read recent community studies about Boulder and Denver and how the Jewish community is growing really rapidly, and why is it that the intermarriage rate in Colorado is over 75%? How does that influence community policies? And then they go out into the local community to sightsee. They are charged with becoming urban ethnographers, or suburban ethnographers, or rural ethnographers. It depends where they go. So they go to analyze the Jewish organizational and cultural landscape as tourists. And they have to write up a final research paper and a multimedia presentation. They have to attend at least 2 local Jewish cultural events. They have to go to 2 Jewish community organizations. They have to talk with 2 Jewish professionals. I don't care who. I don't care if they're religious or secular. It's really up to them. And then I also organize an informal tour of Jewish Denver. So these are students who live up in Boulder. Denver is about, I don't know, like 35 minutes south. But have you ever heard of the Boulder bubble, or the People's Republic of Boulder? People very infrequently leave unless they have to go to the airport. So it's something about the mountains. I don't know what it is. Anyway, so I force them to leave their Boulder bubble. And so what we do is we go on a tour of Jewish Denver. So the top photo is a photo of one of my students actually at Ikar, which is the new Jewish farm. So it's sort of, they're trying to construct a Jewish kibbutz, like an urban kibbutz that has workers who live on the land and work the land, but it's also open to the community to work the land. There are community gardens. I guess you would call it urban moshav because it's not a socialist experiment. It's grant funded. They also, as everything is, I mean, that's just the world of funding. On the right is Jewish Kitsch at the East Side Kosher Deli. That is an enormous gingerbread dreidel with frosting, and my student was mesmerized by that. And then they also visit, among other places, a local Jewish museum. It's called the Mizell Museum, which also funds the Cell, which is a community-empowered learning and living laboratory that is funded by Larry Mizell, a very well-known, very wealthy developer in Colorado, but it's all about domestic terrorism. And I actually have ideas that it's really one man's Jewish paranoia about how we're all going to die. So anyway, and finally, we finish off that excursion with culinary tourism. We have corned beef sandwiched between two latkes at the East Side Kosher Deli. OK, so after teaching this course a couple times, what I've realized is that it's actually a spiral. So I said before, it's not a linear course. It's a spiral, and it toggles back and forth conceptually and spatially and in historical time in a circular fashion to understand the Jewish past and the Jewish present through the lens of both movement and place, so rootedness and running around. And my goal is for students to see the complex linkages of ideas and historical experiences and relationships among Jews within a wider global world. And so we do this really through looking at Jews in these specific places and the movement of Jews between those places. So Dr. Seuss's book ends with the following. Here's what the narrator says. It's not the protagonist. The narrator says, "You'll get mixed up, of course. You already know. You'll get mixed up with strange birds as you go. So be sure when you step. Step with great care and great tact, and remember that life is a great balancing act. Just never forget to be dexterous and deft, and never mix up your right foot with your left." It sounds like talking about kashrut. So be your name Buxbaum, or Bixby, or Bray, or Mordechai, Ali, Van Allen, O'Shea. You're off to great places. Today is your day. Your mountain is waiting. So new. Get on your way. What are you waiting for? So as with many of his children's books, Dr. Seuss, his message mixes inspiration with this slight undertone of the sinister and this awareness of how terribly things can and do go awry. And I think it's perhaps glib, but it's also an apt way for students to think about the complexities of Jewish life in the 19th and the 20th and the 21st centuries. And this is alongside their wrestling with their own questions of who do they want to be in this world and where do they want to go. Thank you. In the front?
Just a second.
Hold on.
You touch upon so many fascinating issues that I can't help but ask you. What was the result of your studies when you compared Jewish people who left Russia and those who stayed? What was the difference in their mindset, attitude? And also, do you have any understanding as a person, as a scientist and sociologist, of why secular Israelis are going to India? Thank you.
Oh, that's a great question. I think I'll answer the second one first. I think that the phenomenon of tiyul is a response to feeling hedged in and feeling surrounded by people's perceptions of hostile Arab states. And you know, the United States is such a mobile society, and people don't really think twice about picking up and moving from New York to LA or getting on a plane and doing that. But in Israel, people don't move that much. Like, people don't move to cities very frequently. There's not a lot of room to go. And so, post-army is really the first time where young adults have an extended period of personal exploration and the freedom to do that, because they are not within any particular institutional framework that is socializing them to the next step. You know, you go through school and then you go to the army. And once you're in the army or out of the army, you get to decide, do I want to go to college or do I want to take a gap year? And most Israelis, I mean, it's become part of Israeli culture. They take the gap year or sometimes they go longer. And it's this release, I think psychologically and collectively, it is a release to get out and go away. I also think that there is a very interesting spiritual reaction to the resolute secularism of Israeli society where Judaism in Israel is seen as the domain of the Orthodox, and most secular Israeli Jews don't want to have anything to do with that. And so Buddhism, for example, or Sufism, or smoking potism, and yogaism, I mean, I don't know what you want to call it, those are attractive because they're safe. They are not tainted with orthodoxy. And so those are appealing. What's also interesting as kind of a post-game follow-up to Tiyul is how Israelis borrow from, like, there's a syncretic kind of hybridization going on where they take yoga and then they discover Judaism, but it's a different form of Judaism than Orthodoxy, and so they do Torah yoga in Tel Aviv. And try to make sense of the two traditions that they're exploring, but on their own terms. And I can point you to some new literature about that. The other question about Russian Jews, wherever they are, Russian Jews are the most amazing example I can think of people who are constantly talking to each other all over the world and going back and forth and flying. It's not, I mean, it's not unusual for, if they have the means, to go back to Moscow or to go to Tel Aviv every year. And I know people who do that. That's also upper middle class Russians. If you are working class, your options are limited. It also depends on whether you have stayed in Russia and you really have conceptualized that as your homeland versus people who are in, say, Israel or the United States who see themselves at home where they are. A lot of people are kind of circulating as cosmopolitans, and other people say, no, I'm actually American, and I privilege that identity more, and that's the past, and I've closed the chapter on that past. So there's no one answer. I think it's pretty varied amongst Russian Jews. Yes, right in the back.
One second. I'll do that. Thank you. Could you comment on the experience of Jews currently living in Berlin? Did most of them have roots there from before World War II, or is this a whole new population?
It's both and. So after the war, the people who returned from displaced persons from the DP camps who went back to Berlin tried to rebuild the community. It was, in the 50s and the 60s, it was small. It was deeply insular and very below the radar in terms of not wanting to shout from the rooftops, we survived, we're Jews, hooray. And the Gemeinde, which was it's the German equivalent of the Jewish Federation. I don't know how else to describe it. The Gemeinde is actually a state-funded institution because there isn't that separation of church and state. So it is state-funded institution, and all Jews who live in, say, Berlin or Düsseldorf or Munich, if you want to be a member of the Jewish community, you have to register with the Gemeinde. Then fast forward to the early 1990s, and thousands of Jews from the former Soviet Union arrive in Germany because the migration policies and the benefits package of becoming a German citizen are quite generous. And most of those Russian, secular, post-Soviet Jews had no interest in registering with the Gemeinde. And so there has been interesting sort of relationships, or lack thereof, between Russian Jews and the established indigenous German Jewish community. And in fact, I can recommend a really interesting book by Jeffrey Peck, which is called Being Jewish in the New Germany, that Rutgers published a couple years ago, which explores all of these tensions and relationships. Interestingly enough, there's also a ton of Israelis living in Berlin. So go figure. Yes. Right there.
I've got this one.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Two observations. I'm guessing that the traveling east, which has been going on for a long time, probably because the destination closest west is tainted Europe. But the other thing, and also per your CV, it would seem that you're sort of like describing Jewishness as a form of queerness, of being both visible and invisible, either voluntarily or rendered invisible at the same time, always on an armistice line, which is not a treaty boundary, which shifts and is untenable. So I think that that's part of, the ability to be in and out of.
Guilty. Totally. Yes. Although I have to say that the Israeli state, the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Education fund and organize many trips for Israeli youth to go to Poland as a form of Holocaust education, as well as nationalist education. And Jackie Feldman writes about this extensively. It's not tainted in the sense that it's off limits for Israeli Jews to go to Europe, but it is certainly conceptualized as dead Jewish space, which is all the more interesting that so many Israeli Jews decide to go to Berlin after they come back from their post-army travels and go to college there, or just live there post-college, because it's such a culturally free and creative and vital kind of place. It is not tainted in that regard. Yeah, it's a fascinating contradiction and a paradox. I don't quite understand it. Any other questions? Yes.
Do your students bring with them or acquire as part of the curriculum a wider understanding of Jewish culture, history, literature, religion, etc.? Because as a standalone, this is a kind of anthropology course that I would associate with somebody wanting to find out about Indonesians or...
Yes and no. Many of my students are not Jewish. I teach at a very large public university, but they're in this class because they're majors in anthropology or international affairs, and it's cross-listed with those classes. So they could take this class amongst thousands. So there's interest there. But also, I have to say that I have a lot of day school students in my classes, and what they come up with as in terms of their Jewish knowledge is kind of fakakta. It's, like they don't know any more or less necessarily that is accurate and scholarly than the non-Jewish students from Aurora, Colorado. So I don't make assumptions about what people know. I start with where they are, which is why we start with the tribe on the very first day. I just swore, sorry.
I think we have time for one more.
Great, in the back, way in the back.
Hi. My question is more going back to the original thing with Habad. A more recent movie, A Serious Man, to me is like an example of mainstream Jewish culture rather than Habad, which is really fringe. Is there, in your class, do you mention the movie or do you explain the difference there?
Can I ask a question back? How would you say that Habad is less mainstream than A Serious Man?
Okay, most
like
Jews are not
distribution
Habad.
channel? Okay.
Most Jews are not
Right,
Habad.
most Jews are secular.
That's correct.
Or it's funny, my students say, I'm Reformed. ED. So, and don't know what that means at all. So, A Serious Man and Hollywood is a great avenue for thinking about images and representation of Jews in sort of the collective unconscious. Chabad is out there in the trenches trying to tell people what it means to be Jewish through practice. So, I've had lots of conversations about A Serious Man. I think it's a very problematic and very troubling and a fascinating film. But I see these as like apples and kumquats. Chabad is community mobilization. They are political organizers, political religious organizers. And so that's really different than seeing A Serious Man, or even like Borat as like some representation of Jewishness or not, or anti-Semitic Jewishness, I don't know. They're two different things. I ask my students to go interview the local Chabad rabbi. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I actually think it's an effective way for them to kind of challenge their own understandings of what does it mean to be Jewish compared to what this guy is saying. And they get some interesting answers.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.